Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to JIVE Talk. This time it's an interview format, but it's more of an informal one this time. I've got someone really cool on. I've got a lot in common with him. Like me, he's a heathen. He's a dad. He is really into sci-fi, horror, pulp fiction kind of things that I used to be into quite a lot. I did my first dissertation on video nasties and horror films and things. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dave Martell, who is known as the host of the BOG and of the Culture Dads, and he is chief of the Biz Archives, which is a pulp and sci-fi publisher. Dave, thanks very much for coming to JIVE Talk.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited, man. I've been watching all your content all this time, and finally Big Dave gets to step up to the plate, so I'm very excited. Today's my birthday, by the way, so I get to celebrate my birthday with one of my favorite dudes.
Sorry, I didn't know it was your birthday. Happy birthday, man.
Thank you, sir.
Haven't dragged you away from your family on this special day.
Nope, all good.
Well, it's been a while. I was on your show like a long time ago now, so I should have got you on mine earlier, but I have not been doing so many shows on JIVE Talk recently. When was it I was on yours?
You came on to first. We did an interview like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. And then you came on we had a Yuletide episode. And then I think you've been on 2 or 3 times. So they're all big hits. So a lot of folks always like it when you come onto the BOG. All the BOG lords always get excited when, Survive the Jive makes an appearance over there. Oh yeah. Speaking of Survive the Jive making an appearance, would you like to can we make a announcement?
Sure, yeah.
So for folks that might not be familiar, or maybe folks abroad, there is a really cool heathen pagan organization here in the United States that I'm very dear friends with called the Ermine Folk. And every year they have one of the biggest, probably the biggest on the East Coast of the United States events called the Folkish Summer Hallowing. And this year, our buddy Tom is flying all the way across the ocean to come to the good old US of A to join us this year for the Folkish Summer Hallowing. And he's going to do a speech. He's going to hang out and do some cool stuff and mingle and all that kind of stuff. So if you are over there, if you are here in the United States, whether you're from, up in New England or down south to North Kakalaki, if you are on the East Coast of the US of A, go check out the Folkish Summer Hallowing and come. You can meet Jive. You can meet me, hang out with all the great people. It's a great time. So go check it out. Go get some tickets.
I'm really looking forward to it, actually, and meeting all the cool people in America. So yeah, get some tickets if you want to meet me and participate in the rituals of the Ermine folk. Anyway, back to the show. We are both heathens or pagans, whatever you want to call, and part of that is respecting the dead, worshipping ancestors or venerating them at least. And also dead heroes, the venerable dead. We venerate the venerable ancestors and heroes. But not all ancestors and dead people fall into that category. And there was always an anxiety in pagan times as well about the dead, particularly like antisocial or not well-liked people, or to people who are somehow involved in certain social taboos were considered more likely to become undead, or what was called in Old Norse Draugr. So those are not worshipped or venerated at all. They're feared. They look like these guys surrounded behind me here. They've got this army of undead. And it should be noted as well, the Einherjar, the army of the dead associated with Odin, are not conceived of as being walking dead corpses in the way that the Draugr are. The Draugr are people who inhabit their graves, the barrows. They're sometimes called haugboi, which means barrow dweller. And while that term later becomes associated with the spirits of barrows, and even in Norway, haugboi is sort of interchangeable now with what we call like a gnome or something like an elf or a tomtenisse. Something like friendly little child thing is called a haugboi. But the haugboi was not considered the spirit of the barrow in the same way as which is the spirit that inhabits the barrow, the burial mound of great men. Rather, a barrow dweller, haugboi in this sense, is one kind of a zombie, like an undead corpse that comes back and causes problems. We'll talk about that and a bit more and explain exactly what they are, and then compare them to the zombies of modern science fiction, comics, video games, and cinema. But first, I just want to ask Dave, who knows a lot about sci-fi and a lot about horror and pulp fiction and this topic in general. How did you first become interested in the undead as a literary and, you know, pulp theme?
Well, this is kind of, the undead kind of fall under an umbrella of many different horror motifs that we find in modern art, period, whether it be film like we see a lot today, or literature, which is kind of in the realm that I exist in, or even in paintings and very various art forms use the motifs of the undead and of other horror things. So the way that I frame it, really, and we'll get into how I got into it, but how I frame horror really is that it's literally the oldest art form that we have, right? When you think of folklore, or when you think of the tales that our ancestors used to tell, what generally were they? They were generally spooky tales, right? That we pass on through the traditions. Even things such as children's stories very much have don't go into the woods, or this monster will eat you, or there's this witch, or this whatever. This is a prevailing motif that goes all the way back to our kind of primordial beginnings. It's the orally telling stories is probably, at least in my summation, the oldest art tradition that we have. And if, in my view, this is a tradition that remains very much alive today. We have this view, especially us as modern people, have this view that everything kind of got chopped off at the world wars, and everything that we do now is different than what we did back then. However, I very much argue that even films such as, I don't know, Jaws, or the various creature features that have happened over time, or things even more science fiction stuff, the original Alien movie, The Thing, these types of stories and film and art and art forms carry the exact same motifs that we look at in folklore of yesteryear into the ancient world. We just call it horror now, which is a genre that we've used. How I got into it really is I grew up just loving fantasy. I love fantasy. I love grim, weird things. I first fell in love with Edgar Allan Poe at a very early age, and then found my way to work greats like H.P. Lovecraft and so on and so forth. Very young. I'm sure there's some folks listening that'll be familiar with Tales from the Crypt magazine and Eerie and Creepy magazine. I've just always adored spooky literature. I love it. I very much love spooky films, and being a heathen, being a pagan, somebody that has at least a working knowledge of the motifs and the ideas of the ancient world, and that appear in ancient literature and our Edic sources and more Homeric sources and stuff like that. I have it has given me an advantage to be able to see the connection between the ancient world and the modern art forms that we have today. And it's really truly fascinating how not modern and not new all of the stuff that we have today really truly is. And it's pretty easy to look at something like Conan the Barbarian or Lord of the Rings and see the mythopoetic origins of these stories and these genres, clear as day. But when you look at the other genres, such as science fiction, such as horror, they're not quite as clear to most people. However, when you just lift up the veil and look underneath the hood and look under the surface just a little bit, you see these very primordial elements, the foundations of these genres. So I've loved it for a long, long time. It's hard to pinpoint when exactly I got into it. Things like dark fantasy and horror and stuff like that. I sort of feel like they've always been with me. To long story short.
Right. I agree so much with what you say about the fact that, like, my kid he will say, he said to me before that he likes something because it's scary. Like a program he watched, I like it because it's always scary. He's 3 years old. And then if I put on like a heavy metal song, he'll hear it and he goes, I like this scary music. I like this. Put the scary music on, Dad. So there's something in there. I didn't teach him to want to be scared. There's something in it. Like you want humans, where we deal with the anxiety of things that are dangerous is to actually want to learn about them. And like this desire to, like this sort of morbid desire to see the scary thing is actually, I think, an instinctive way of learning about it. Because, you know, how do you hunt the tiger? You start off by wanting to know all about the tiger. And, you know, like you talked about the Alien, the Thing, Predator, those are all to me the dragon. They're all the ancient, the dragon, the serpent in different forms of motif. But the undead is not the dragon, it's not the serpent, it's a kind of a different thing. I think it reflects a different anxiety altogether from that of the dragon, which is like the enemy without, whereas the dead are the enemy within, in a sense. But let's tell, because not everyone here is a heathen and knows about our religion, and also even some of the heathens might not be fully aware of what exactly a Draugr is and to what extent it differs from a zombie or a vampire that you would be more familiar with from modern fiction. So let's give a little bit of a rundown. I mean, I'll let you start, Dave, because I got some notes I can go through, and then I'll see what you have to say about Draugr, and then I'll go through my notes afterwards if there's anything you left out.
Yeah, exactly how you just explained it. The Draugr is very much sort of a how could I say it? The sire of the vampire and of the zombie. You know, the Draugr is like this proto form, like, you know how when you go looking into like prehistoric animals, like both a pig and a whale came from this certain species. It's the same exact thing. The Draugr, whether you're looking at things like the Grettis saga, or it very much appears, the main sources of it come from the Icelandic sagas, period. But however, a similar archetype, similar motif appears in other cultural things, and then later in the medieval period picks up the name revenant, which is a little bit which sort of kind of kept the same vibe. But the Draugr is very much an undead creature, a risen walking dead. In fact, some of the names for it just literally mean after walker, like it has risen from the grave. And unlike modern zombies, our modern understanding of zombies, which is actually sort of taken from like voodoo and stuff like that, Afro and Caribbean sort of cultures, at least that's what I've read. And it differs from the vampire, which is very much a Victorian motif. The vampire, if you look back in history, vampires aren't like Dracula, which we can actually get into that, because the Draugr is very influential on how we understand the vampire, which is a very important storytelling motif as well. But the Draugr appears, it is a walking dead. It is something that has risen from the grave. A lot of times it is it is somebody that has earthly attachments that they can't let go of. They're greedy. They love this certain place. They protect their burrow, their mound. They can't leave their tomb. They a lot of times they're cursed, right? It's not like a zombie where it's just like a walking cannibal, which, Mr. Tom, you just mentioned about how the zombie is different than, say, the creature feature like a Jaws or a Cujo or something like that. I would actually disagree a little bit. I think that the zombie does have that primordial hunter type of element with it as well, and I think that's a meaningful thing to get into. But the Draugr does have this a little bit. Like there's certain stories where it hunts people. It is very much envious of the living, which is something that we find in all of Indo-European and pagan understanding, right? And in Indo-European and pagan understanding, it is not like we don't have a salvation religion. It's not a religion where you are working to leave this dirty material realm and ascend to somewhere. It is very much that life is the best, is very life affirming, and that death isn't as good. It's okay. It's something you have to go through. It happens, but it is not as good as being alive. So therefore, the dead envy the living. So when you have a corrupt or perverted or sinful or rotten kind of person, and they can't let go of the world, and they've committed so many bad things in this world, they stick around and they become a mockery of nature, a walking dead and after walker, a Draugr. And the Draugrs that appear in the Icelandic sagas and in the Germanic sources are these cursed. They wield sorcery. They have great strength. They're not mindless. They have some sentience, but they're almost like a lich, where they have this perverted, depraved type of sentience. They're not like they were in life. They can wield weapons. They guard treasure. They can control storms and weather at times. For them to gaze upon you is to put a curse on you for all time, and then you may become a Draugr. They're these really formidable, powerful, terrifying entities that our ancestors very much feared. And I would put forth that I think that we as believers, as actual practicing pagans, should be very careful not to just look at them as archetypes or as just motifs, which they are in some cases, but to actually just look at them as this is literally what our ancestors believed. They believed these guys to be real, and they really, really feared them. So I think that it is important as an authentic practitioner and believer of the ancestral faith to put ourselves in their shoes, as opposed to maybe a purely academic standpoint.
Well put, Dave. Yeah, I agree. Like, they are, we can consider the reality of them as well, but they're not something that's like apparently common, but they're definitely something feared. As you say, they're extremely strong. They have a superhuman strength, and they can possess magical powers, like shape-shifting, the ability to dream travel. Someone said in the comments they hate this nightmare sleep paralysis beings. Well, Draugr could be associated with that too, because they would believe that they could, dream travel and haunt you in your dreams as well as in real life. They could curse you. They could be associated with plagues, disease. But then again, so were the elves, so were the dwarves. Many entities in Nordic paganism are also associated with disease. Even the gods can be associated with diseases. They can have certain immunity. They can be immune to certain weapons, and that's depicted in the film The Northman. And they also associated with something called barrow fires, which are these ghostly fires that appear on barrows. And if you see a ghostly fire on a barrow, it means that there's probably going to be a Draugr about. And actually, although that's something from heathen times, the belief in barrow fires endured in Scandinavia at least until the 18th century. I know that there's accounts in 18th century of people seeing barrow fires, these ghostly fires on top of the barrow. I don't know if even further, maybe even more recent. There are, as well, outside of Scandinavia, possible an English potential cognate of Draugr is Dreag, which means an apparition or ghost, but it's only attested in Irish English, so in Irish Gaelic. So it's thought to be a Gaelic loanword from Old English, but in Old English, attested words they would use for such entities would be dvímor or gastas, which means with the modern word ghost derives from that. They are referred to from the 19th century onwards by some people as whites, and that's also what the word barrow white is used by Tolkien to refer to them. That is somewhat anachronistic, because they didn't use the word white. The word white in Old English, or wheat, meant a living being. So the one thing you definitely wouldn't call a white is a Draugr, because it's not alive. But that's quite a common name for them now, as whites. And I think that the Game of Thrones whites are essentially Draugr, what was depicted in Game of Thrones. They defend their graves from robbers. So Dave was saying that they can, hoard treasure, a bit like a dragon there. But the difference is that not necessarily a great treasure, just whatever they were buried with, their own grave goods, basically. And while some of them are therefore, obviously great men in life, like kings, Not all of them are. Some of them, like Glam, was a slave in life. So you can be the highest man or the lowest man can end up being a Draugr. It doesn't appear to relate to their status. Whereas the dead who can be seen as elves are exclusively high status people. So Draugr can be anyone. And someone compared them to hungry ghosts in Buddhism. I don't know a lot about that, but Draugr do seem to be hungry. They will eat food offerings that are given to them. There's one saga where they eat a falcon and a horse, and they will also even try to eat human flesh, just like zombies in modern sci-fi. They also like to do. They're more commonly not like. It's not like they come out the grave and start like a zombie and just chasing people and biting them. They're more likely like a pain in the ass rather than an immediate threat to your life necessarily. Like more commonly, they're associated with things like making animals mad and like pestering the livestock, or something called riding the roof, which basically means that the Draugr like to climb on top of the roof of your house and just cause a racket and wake everyone up in the middle of the night. So it's like, seems almost comical, but that's also depicted in the Northman when the protagonist Amleth is running around on the roof at a time when people believe him to be dead. It's sort of implying that he is like a Draugr because he's on the roof. Someone says also they like to put holes in the roof. Well, the way to kill a Draugr is not so dissimilar to zombies. You have to cut their head off. That's often the case with in zombie films too. Right? You have to cut their head off, or sometimes you just have to bash their head in sufficiently. But in old times, the pagans would be a way to kill the Draugr, but also a way to prevent the Draugr rising in the first place would be things like, putting a big heavy stone on top of the corpse or burying it in a particular way. And they would do this to certain people who in life had done things that made them believe that this is a person who would be likely to become a Draugr. And that would mean, or an afterganger, that means an after walker. And that is usually someone who's like, there's something wrong with them, like they were evil or malcontent. So there's people who not necessarily like have to be evil, but they have to be malcontent, like not satisfied with their life when they were alive. Somehow a problem socially, like whether it's because they were evil or because they were just malcontent or because nobody liked them, like they were disliked by the community. Those are the people think this guy's going to come back. And it's usually, as far as I can tell, it's only guys. I can't remember any female Draugr in any of the sagas, but and another thing they did, not sure if this is actually a way to prevent the Draugr rising or whether it was just an insult to the dead, but in Grettir's saga, after cutting off the head, he shoves the nose of the Draugr into its own arse, so between his buttocks. So is that could be a ritual way of preventing it rising again, or it could just be a way of saying F you, like I hate you, like that, which just as it would be today. So as you can see, there's a lot of parallels with the modern zombie, even though it's not exactly the same. But there's such a great diversity in zombie films. Like I consider Evil Dead to be a zombie film, personally. Sure. That one has a lot. These things get risen by a kind of ancient pagan magic. I think it's Sumerian in the Necronomicon. Yeah. And they're magical. They're not like they're bound in their flesh corpses, just like the Draugr. But they also have magical powers that make things move around, and they can do all kinds of crazy stuff that is completely supernatural, and that's much more like a Draugr. So I think Evil Dead is a good sort of example of it, and I think that's a great film too, personally.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I was actually going to bring that up, that I believe the Deadites that you see in the Evil Dead films are a much better analog for the Draugr than maybe like Day of the Dead or Dawn of the Dead or 28 Days Later, and which we could talk about too, because there is a meaningful difference between what kind of gets referred to as science zombies and then supernatural zombies. Because these two things have different motifs, as do vampires. We very much have a large spread of what the undead represent in modern art, right? We look at, when you think of the undead, you obviously the first thing comes to mind if you are in the modern Western world, you're thinking of the zombie horde, right? The risen, walking, mindless dead that are looking to eat brains, and they're coming into your town, and this motif, in my opinion, is actually sort of similar to some of the elements that the Draugr represents. And this is what we would call the uncanny, right? The uncanny. And one of the things with the uncanny that we very much keep employing over and over again when we draw from our pot of soup, which is what Tolkien called it. Tolkien had this whole theory, he called it the cauldron of stories, or the pot of soup, that there is the same storytelling elements. Today we call them tropes, but I kind of take issue with this word. But we have these reoccurring story elements that we just keep using over and over again, these archetypes, and we pull from the pot of soup, and we have a little bit different flavor, a little bit different arrangement, depending on the epoch that we exist in, but it is still fundamentally the same premises that go into writing our stories and telling our stories, because these are things that just happen over and over and over again in history. We can't change who we are. We're fundamentally, genetically, phenotypically the same, the same creatures as we were thousands of years ago. So that's not going to change spiritually as well, I would argue. However, when we're talking about the uncanny is that which is sort of familiar, but not familiar, right? And one of the things that we love in all fiction, especially horror fiction, whether it be of supernatural or cosmic or science fiction bend, is this mockery of the human form, this mockery of nature, this mockery of how we're supposed to be. Now, when you think of Uncanny Valley, the first thing that comes to mind is like these videos of like androids or robots that are kind of weird and a little bit off kilter, and it makes us uncomfortable. However, this element is also found in the undead. When we look upon there's something that is not supposed to be, it has an air of familiarity, but we know instinctively that it's not supposed to be. This is something that we do, that we keep telling over and over again, because it kind of breaks down this, like, I guess you could say, ego, this comfort of familiarity when it comes to the most intimate part of our understanding of ourselves, which is what is human. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's a one.
I'd like to make a point on that, because
Sure.
the Uncanny Valley, as you say, is mostly androids, but it applies here also to the undead, and raises the question of what is human, which is also the question we raise with android. When we see androids, we see it, or a doll. But when we watch zombie films, often or any creature feature, this often is actually literally we're watching a doll. In many cases, it is some kind of contrivance that's being animated by a hand or whatever. And this is something also Odinic, because Odin animates us. We as humans in our belief system are animated by Odin and his brothers originally, but he also is capable of animating idols. It said he makes idols speak. There are speaking idols of Odin, which is like a puppet show or an android, and this as well is a source of fear for us. And also he's a necromancer, because Odin raises witches from the dead to learn arcane knowledge from them. So raising a corpse, raising a tree and making it speak, or like a puppet, or actually imbuing mankind with life, are all Odinic things, and they're all interchangeable in a certain respect, and a source of anxiety for us, because we see ourselves very much as distinct from an animated corpse. But that's also a trope in the zombie films, which I don't like, which is the whole thing of what's the difference between us and them? Like they feed upon each other and we feed upon each other. I think it's a bit trite, but it is a thing. What's the difference between us and them is a source of anxiety. I want to be. What makes us fear them is a recognition of the self in the other, to some extent. Sorry to sound Hegelian.
I would also point out that I think a lot of the nervousness when it comes to creations, like us being the ones that create the zombies or animate the corpses or whatever, whether you're talking about I believe in 28 Days Later, the film, we create a virus and it turns these things into that, whether we're talking about Herbert West Reanimator, the Reanimator film, or even Yeah, it's fantastic. What a classic. But
Yeah.
also, I would also like to point out Frankenstein as well. The original, and this goes to I'm going to get to this point. One of the original titles of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster, or the new Prometheus, right? What is the story of Prometheus? The story of Prometheus is Prometheus goes and he steals the fire from the gods and defies them with his hubris. And for his crimes, he is damned to be tied to a rock and birds eat his guts out forever and ever and ever till the end of time. This also goes into the nervousness that we have about creation, as you mentioned. When we talk about us creating, us animating, us making these mockeries, is that the gods they created us. Odin gives us und, right? He gives us the holy breath. He animates us. It is up to the gods to do that. That is a godly thing to do. That is not something for man to do. So when we tell these stories of we were the ones, either intentionally or by accident, creating or animating a corpse or a living conscious entity or something, we are doing something that is very hubris. And 9 times out of 10, actually more, just about every single story of this flavor ends up with monstrous results, ends up with us being damned, either being consumed by the zombie horde, being like going mad or whatever. It always ends up in our doom and our destruction, our damnation. It is very Promethean in this sense. Insofar it is we're doing something that the gods are supposed to do and that man is not. It is nervousness of the potential Faustian hubris, the Promethean hubris that we see in these tales.
That's definitely comes through in some of the zombie films too, when the modern ones where it's like, oh, a nuclear accident has caused it, or someone, or even with Evil Dead, where it's like you're messing with this Necronomicon book, like you're going too far, you're going beyond the limits that mankind should do, and then as a result, the undead horde come. Of course, someone was asking earlier, do the Draugr appear in hordes? And the answer is no, they don't. They're usually singular, whereas the zombie is in modern fiction, it's the horde. Another person in the comments has said a problem with zombie films is they're often left-wing, which is an interesting point to make, because I understand that aside from the association of zombies with like with the voodoo, as Dave pointed out, is a major influence on the whole thing, but the undead is much older, of course, as a concept. But there was an initial idea in like 50s zombie in comics and things in the 50s or whatever. The zombie was kind of like a metaphor for the fear of communism, because the word zombie itself is talking about, like, if you say someone's a zombie, it means they're mindless, they're just going along with things, whereas the Draugr has a very much an intent and a will of its own. The zombie doesn't. It's like it's mindless, that was why it was like a metaphor for communist brainwashing. Like your own family could turn against you and try to consume you if the communist mind virus spread out. But then by the 60s, particularly with like George A. Romero's The Night of the Living Dead and onwards, there's definitely been a left-wing thing instead. And he's made some valid things, like in the second zombie film he did, I think it's called Dawn of the Dead, where there's like a critique of consumerism, where the zombies all want to go shopping in a mall. That's quite interesting as a motif for explaining it too. But yeah, the Hollywood's become more left-wing, so of course zombie films have become more left-wing. But I think my opinion is that the reason that there was like a zombie revival in the early 2000s that was really big, like, and people started like remaking the 80s and the 70s zombie films, is not because of any of the actual intended meanings of the zombies, but it was simply because the scenario depicting a zombie apocalypse, whether it's caused by nuclear waste or magic, or it doesn't matter, the scenario throws people into a survival scenario in which masculine virtues are valuable again. And so many men felt devalued at that time by the prevailing culture of the West and the depictions of it in popular culture, that they wanted to have this escapism to a world where suddenly things like being prepared for disaster and being able to cut off a guy's head were suddenly really valuable skill sets and made like, you a valuable member of the community. So that's my opinion. What do you think, Dave?
I would definitely agree with that. I would also, at least for the allure of young guys going to see it, right? They might not be able to articulate it, but they certainly feel some kind of way when they're watching a guy on screen and he's, slaughtering zombies, and he's actually, because that is a problem in modernity. And this is, I'm going to get into kind of my idea of the modern zombie and what it represents. But as Ted Kaczynski said, we do a lot of what are called surrogate activities to kind of reconnect with our actual fundamental purpose. Like in the modern day, right? It's good to go to the gym. It's good for you. It's good to get into martial arts, and it's good to do all this kind of stuff. But in reality, those things just don't really have a function in modernity. If you why would you want to get strong? Why do you want to get good at martial arts? So you can be superior at wielding violence. Well, in modernity, if you are superior at wielding violence and you actually wield violence, you're going to go to jail. You're going to get in trouble. It's actually they have made true masculine function obsolete. So we do these surrogate activities to kind of fulfill that, and to watch these films, as certain goofballs like a Stephen King, who I don't like, would call that male power fantasy or whatever, which I actually think male power fantasies are a positive thing. If a male is going to fantasize about something, allow him to fantasize about power. Right.
Hey, it's better than when Stephen King fantasizing about children having orgies in a sewer.
Oh yeah, what a scumbag! We're not even gonna get started on that guy and his weird, goofy face, looking like Hellboy with his face makeup washed off, looking like a burn victim with his swollen, stupid head. I don't like that guy at all. But going back to my point here is that a lot of what the modern zombie film has, and this goes into how a lot of the actual kind of organic human experience that we had in more ancient times has been rendered obsolete, and we still have these desires. Is one of them is we have kind of lost our relationship with our own mortality, and more modernity and liberalism and industrial society has created this egoism, this hubris, that we have sort of conquered nature. We no longer have to fear nature. We live in buildings where there's climate control, wall-to-wall carpets, and we don't have to look over our shoulder at something that's trying to eat us anymore. We have conquered. We have won. And what the zombie film does, whether or not the leftoids that create them believe this, is what it does is it's nature re-exerting itself, and it is also us kind of expressing our nervousness having to do with our own mortality and our death and our afterlife, and it creates this kind of like mockery of it, right? How many people in today's world believe nothing? Most people believe nothing. Most people don't even believe in afterlife. They don't believe in divinity. It is completely a materialist framework from which they create their Weltanschauung. And with this comes the nervousness of their own mortality. This, like, what happens after I die? Oh, it just goes black. And it makes it nervous. So what they do is they create these zombie films of death itself, a walking incarnation of death itself coming to look you in the face and eat you, which is a very kind of predatory, primordial thing, right? It's like all of our all of the nervousness and anxieties of modern people kind of balled up into this one thing, right? So there's a lot to kind of unpack with that. And there's this meme that goes on.
That's one thing, if I may interrupt you, Dave, that's one thing that you've just picked up on that also links back to the Draugr, because I think the Draugr reflects, reality of it aside, the Draugr does reflect an anxiety of those people about dealing with the dead. And that's reflected in the burial customs and the ways of preventing the Draugr from coming, and the way that they resolve that, like, and on the beliefs that, like, for example, that a seated burial, which was not a common custom at the time, would encourage Draugr to rise up, someone to become Draugr. This kind of thing. It's like they have taboos of burials in that culture. Burials are a very important part of their culture because it's helping people to transfer them to the other world, and the Draugr reflects that anxiety about this, vital part of their belief system about the transition to the next world, and that same anxiety is what you've just identified in the zombie as like in the rootless man, in the modern man with no gods and no hereafter. There's a kind of death. The specter of death is like staring into the void. So even like the Catholics have the memento mori, the skull is a way of like just reminding them to rein their ego in, and because they're going to die and their life is finite, and then they're going to be judged by Yahweh, and he's going to tell them off for being naughty. So like the skull or the dead body is the new kind of memento mori for the modern post-Christian man. But it doesn't seem to have any there's no reconciliation in it. There's no consolation. It's just a source of anxiety, fear, and titillation as well. Like it's quite an amusing sort of diversion.
Yeah. And this also goes into kind of their obsession with transhumanism as well, right? Transhumanism is pretty much now we could get into like, there's a lot of philosophical stuff around it that we could get into. But in my view, at the end of the day, transhumanism is kind of a cope for atheists and materialists, which is what a lot of these kind of liberal people are, right? Even if they say that they have some sort of, they're so weird because they have this complete bizarre mishmash of all of these. They believe in things like they'll believe in metaphysical things like justice and freedom and all of these kinds of things, even though it is kind of weird and all this, but then they don't believe in metaphysical things like the soul and the being. They kind of have this idea that there's this human essentialism that is beyond material, but also at the same time they are materialists. It's a really strange kind of incoherent belief system that they have. But the transhumanism stuff is very much a cope for them, right? They don't believe that there is going to be life after life, so they must continue life forever on, right? You will go see in kind of those like IF and love science kind of forums, they're always getting where, oh well, if we just do this gene screening, they do this gene editing, then we can reverse aging and we can just live forever. It is all about their cope, that they don't believe in an afterlife, and that's why a lot of these people really love zombie films, because we have this morbid fascination. Just humans in general have this morbid fascination, and I don't think any of us are without this, that we love to look in the mirror for a second to see a glimpse of what is monstrous about ourselves, and then like look away real quick, right? But never internalize it. Never be like Marcus Aurelius and like learn from it and develop self-awareness. These people, the thralls of the world, like to look at the mirror for a split second and then look away and never learn anything from it. It's almost like an amusement park ride for them, right? It's pretty interesting phenomenon. What's that?
The haunted house ride.
Exactly.
It's the fun. It's the thrill. It's the thrill of confronting death briefly, but not having the courage to look any deeper.
It's the surrogate activity of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've touched on some really interesting points there. Like, and the zombie can be used to, communicate all kinds of different political perspectives, because it's very versatile, which is probably also partly why it's such an enduring trope. I mean, I guess in Resident Evil, it's something to do with like genetic engineering or bioengineering. There's many the Return of the Living Dead films. It's some kind of nuclear runoff. There's a lot of nuclear or eco horror films, like the trauma films are often whole eco horror genre, and the Evil Dead and the Book of the Necronomicon. I'm not sure in George Romero's like series of films what the actual cause is, but there is like this whole thing of running through them, of getting used to the zombies, and like that he is he seems to be suggesting that the ultimate solution is that they learn to live with the zombies, and that starts in the second one at least, and then is still going on in the later ones, which I don't even watch the last ones because it gets sillier and sillier. But I'm not a big fan of all George Romero's films, but I think the first couple are interesting at least. But but it's kind of like learn to live with it, and that reminds me of some of the rhetoric that people say when people complain about certain very real and serious, dangerous elements within society. They're told nowadays, no, that's part and parcel. You have to learn to live with it. Which I imagine if there was a zombie apocalypse in real life, we'd probably have politicians saying something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I would also, when we're talking about the Draugr, I mean, I do think an important archetype that is in literature is also the vampire, because as we mentioned before, the Draugr very much has a lot of elements of many different types of undead, correct? And I think that the vampire very much holds some of the most important aspects of the Draugr, which in my opinion, the Draugr, probably the most important part of him is that he is something, he is like a corruption of somebody that was previously alive that became undead through their misdeeds, right? And they very much hoard gold, they hoard treasure. And you attributed this to the dragon archetype, which I actually think it's interesting that Dracula is connected to the word dragon, right?
Yeah, I mean, son of the dragon. Yeah, I think it makes that. Yeah, that is interesting.
So the vampire, if you go and you look at the Victorian literature, right, the original supernatural stuff. Now, if you some of the very early stuff like Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole is very much more into the supernatural kind of ghost haunted house stuff. But here you start seeing at least the story devices developing that lead to something like a Dracula, like the Bram Stoker tales, right? If you and then later on into the films, and Victorian literature is very different than some of the supernatural or even like the cosmic horror stuff later on, which is a completely different device. The vampire is very much an incarnation of sin, right? And the Draugr is sort of this as well. Now, obviously, the Germanic understanding of sin is a little bit different than the Christian understanding. The original Gothic literature is very Protestant in nature, right? It's a lust, it's greed. Dracula is lust, he's greed, he's all of these things. He sits in his castle and he's very scheming and deceptive, and he in fact, I think he actually, in Bram Stoker, describes him as the son of the devil himself or something like this. But the Draugr is not too far removed from this idea that if you do not live a virtuous life in accordance to kind of the virtues of the gods, etc., then you can become this kind of monstrous, rotten thing and not get to go on and pass into the next world and eventually be reincarnated and all of these kinds of things. You kind of get stuck here as this mockery, this perversion of life itself, right? So I think the vampire also holds a lot of the Draugr's important attributes.
It's good points, yeah, because the Draugr, like a vampire, has the ability to shapeshift, like vampires turn into bats and wolves. And in Bram Stoker's Dracula, he calls them, listen to them, the children of the night, referring to the wolves. So the wolves are like his beings. Like there's like this connection to animals, which some Draugr have at least. And there's also, I'm not clear on this because I have not read the saga literature with this in it, but apparently some sagas say like that there's a contagious element where like someone gets bitten and killed by a Draugr, and then as a result become a Draugr themselves. So that's very interesting because that also ties in with the zombie as virus sort of thing, except it isn't described as a disease at all in the sagas. It's more like the vampire thing. It's more like a curse passing on than a disease.
Exactly.
But that's quite interesting. And I also think that Bram Stoker's Dracula, it's the only Victorian vampire book I have read, but that is, I think, very much a right-wing themed novel about and it was about anxiety about foreigners coming, buying up real estate and stealing women. That's basically what he comes to do. It's like a Romanian aristocrat is able to buy property in London and then steal the protagonist's wife or girlfriend or whatever, fiance rather. It's been a long time since I read it, but yeah, that's that whole like romantic and sexual element of the vampire is being developed more and more and more over the 20th century in fiction, but it was there in Bram Stoker, but it's not there in the Draugr. There's no sexual elements to the Draugr. No. I don't believe, but that sort of fear of the foreigner is not popular in cinema now. It never made it to the Hollywood era because they cut that out because they don't like that stuff, obviously, the people in Hollywood. But it's there, and I recommend people read Bram Stoker if you want to see like a kind of original. Someone's talking about Herzog's version of Nosferatu. That is a good film, a good adaptation. And there's a new adaptation of Nosferatu coming by Robert Eggers. That's his next film.
Really?
Yeah, he's going to do Nosferatu for the next one. So I don't know if he'll be able to top Herzog's, because Herzog's is pretty much, I think it's a masterpiece. It's a bit different from many vampire films, but I think it's well worth watching.
You're talking the black and white one, Shadow of the Vampire.
No, the remake, the color remake by Werner Herzog from the 1980s, I think it was. The black and white one is definitely, a cinema, an important milestone in cinema history, but it's a bit not my favorite because it's a bit old, to watch the 20s black and white films. It is very impressive for the time, the techniques used, the shadows on the walls and things like that. But it's quite crude technology compared to what we're expecting. Whereas Herzog, I think, faithfully adapted the old film to a color medium using his great skills as a filmmaker. I'm a big fan of Werner Herzog. Yeah, maybe the Northman follow-up. The Robert Eggers film will be good. I've loved every other film by Robert Eggers, so I've got my hopes up for this too. But yeah. He's
the only one I saw so far is the Northman. I haven't seen his other. I heard that he did. Did he do that one? Those the Lighthouse or something like that?
He did The Witch, which is.
I did see The Witch. The Witch. I love it.
That's a really good horror film, I think. And then he did The Lighthouse, which is a pagan myth by his own. He says that's a pagan myth. He invented a pagan myth where what would happen if Proteus and Prometheus interacted. So one of the characters in The Lighthouse represents Proteus and the other represents Prometheus. And there's some very obvious symbology from the myth in the film to show that they represent those characters too. But then the Northman, he's got I've done a whole video about all the pagan themes in that. So he's definitely conscious of integrating pagan themes into his films, which I think is really cool.
Has anybody ever seen him wearing a hammer or anything like that? Is he one of our guys?
I've never heard of that, but I've got my suspicions. I don't know. You never know for sure. But as long as he keeps making films that I enjoy, then I won't mind. But yeah, we're moving. We've got 5 minutes left of the stream, and should we? I would like to give you the last word, Dave. What have you got to any last points to summarize about the undead and do you have any fear of the undead?
So I actually am a very superstitious person myself. I could end it. I actually have a quick anecdote I could share if you don't mind, if you'd like that. So I am myself. I'm a very superstitious person, right? I believe in I believe in spirits and land spirits and all this kind of stuff. I'm somebody that's very conscious at all times of these kinds of things. I put out offerings for my house, for the whites in my house, the spirits in my house. I am myself a very superstitious person. I'm also somebody, I believe in cryptids and all of this kind of stuff because I believe that I've experienced some of this, and that's a story for another time. But I actually have speaking of Draugrs, I actually have a pretty cool anecdote. It's not my story, but I heard it from a source that is pretty. And I'll just tell you guys the story real quick. It's pretty cool. So when I was younger, I was a young man. When I was probably late teens, early 20s, something like that, I had a buddy that we used to hang out with, pretty much a member of the bro squad. And a lot of times we would meet up at his house and, get together, have cookouts or get ready to go fishing or whatever we were doing as young men, go party and raise hell, whatever we were doing. And this guy, he lived with his grandparents, and his grandfather was a really cool guy, really cool grandpa. And his name was Dave too. And I, because we were both named Dave, we got along really well. His family was actually from the same area that my father's family was from. So we used to like joke about how we were cousins and we were related and stuff like, which we probably were. There's not that many people from that area, but Grandpa Dave had this really cool story one time. And the one time we were getting all geared up to go to the movie theaters, and I can't remember exactly what movie came out. We were going to go see a zombie movie. I can't remember. Maybe it was, I don't know, 28 Days Later or World War Z or whatever movie was out at that time. We were going to go see it, and we were like, "Hey, Grandpa Dave, you want to come with us to go see this film?" And whoa, what's it about? And, we were like, "It's a zombie movie." And he says, I don't really want to go see a movie because I've seen one of them in real life. And we're like, all right, you got to tell us this story. So Grandpa Dave, he's not like a embellishment kind of guy. He's not the kind of guy to tell tall tales. He's a very religious dude, very happy go lucky kind of. He's the kind of grandpa that sits in your car and you turn it on, he can tell you exactly what's wrong with it. He told a lot of corny jokes, but he wasn't the kind of guy that would make up tall tales. So it leads me to believe that what he experienced, he actually saw. And here's his story: is he grew up in the reaches of the Appalachian Mountains here in Pennsylvania. His family had a big farm estate that all of his cousins and uncles and everybody lived on, which is how we used to live here in good old Pennsylvania, right? He lived on this big family farm estate. Well, when he was a little kid, his father, he used to help his father on the farm, right? They lived on a farm. They had a very agrarian life. And he had an uncle that lived on the property his name was Uncle George. And apparently Uncle George was a very bad man. I can't remember what war he fought in or anything like that. But he went to, I believe it was World War I. He went and fought in World War I and came home and was pretty messed up from it. But the story goes that he was actually a pretty nasty guy since he was a little kid. He lived on the property. He was a really bad miser. He after the war, he did very good for himself. Built a very a nice little nest egg, became very independently wealthy, never shared a dime with anybody. There was warnings that if you were a little girl, do not get around Uncle George. Uncle George was thought to be a pervert. He was just a very nasty, bad man. And it was, all the kids and everything that lived on the family estate were said, don't go near Uncle George's house. Uncle George is a bad man. Well, Uncle George passed away, and he died, and they buried him on the property, which is what we used to do back in the day. We used to have a family cemeteries on our family estates and stuff like that, and Uncle George was buried there. Well, one night when Grandpa Dave and his father were out closing up for the evening, they were going and putting away some stuff down on the other side of the property, doing something with the livestock, getting ready to head in for the night. Well, they were they were doing this whole thing, and they heard a crunch behind them. Right, it was evening time. It was evening in the deep of autumn. It was getting chilly out. Right. They heard a crunch behind them, something stepping on dry leaves, and they both turned around. There's bears out there in Appalachia. There's bears. There's mountain lions. There are dangerous animals, big animals out there that you gotta keep a gun on yourself. You got to be careful walking around at night. You just got to be careful. So they turn around and they look, assuming that it's going to be a bear or a mountain lion or something of the sort, and they see a figure standing there. They look at this figure, and it was Uncle George wearing the clothes that he was buried in, except it did not look like Uncle George completely. He was very blue, purplish color. He was had a horrible stench. That's what Dave described. The first thing that he noticed was this horrible stench when he saw his Uncle George standing there. He looked bloated. He had milky, whited eyes, and he was standing there in the clothes that he was buried in. And they stood there kind of frozen in fear, looking at this, what could have been an apparition, but what he believes to be his Uncle George risen from the grave. And he said his father immediately pulled the pistol out from his holster and pushed his young son, Grandpa Dave at the time, behind him. And he said, he told the apparition, he told the creature, he said, it's time for you to go rest now, George. You're not supposed to be here no more. It's your time to go be with God, George. And when he said that to the creature took a couple steps. Well, Grandpa Dave and his father turned tail and ran back to their truck, peeled off up the way and went back home. And he said that his father stayed up all night with his shotgun and they watching out for this thing. And he told little Grandpa Dave, go into your room, lock your door, and say your prayers. And he did so. And his father stayed up all night with his shotgun, looking out, patrolling the area. And he said for the next week, his dad and all of his uncles patrolled the property every single night. The kids were on lockdown. They weren't allowed to go out by themselves. They weren't allowed out at night. So they took it very, very seriously. And he said he never spoke about it again with his father after that. But he said that, he saw what he believes to be a walking cadaver of his Uncle George. And by his description, it sounds like Grandpa Dave saw a Draugr. So that's my anecdote.
That's a scary story. That's a scary
Freaky,
story,
right?
Dave. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. I really appreciate that. And everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's guest, Dave Martell. Be sure to check out his channel. It's linked in the description and the title. And check out some of the things he's selling, some of the books and such he's selling on the bizarchives.com as well. Some great stuff. He's doing a really good job at promoting the kind of artists and creators whose work won't get published by some of the mainstream channels these days. So, yeah, I really enjoyed having you on, Dave. It's a pleasure as always. This has been Jive Talk. Good night, everybody.